The ceremonial hall fell silent the moment Elara spoke. She stood before the raised dais, her hands steady at her sides, her voice calm despite the weight of 100 eyes pressing against her back. The Alpha King sat above her, in carved oak and shadow, his expression unreadable beneath the low light of iron chandeliers. The elders flanked him on either side, their weathered faces frozen in expectation. "I will not be your bride," she said again, softer this time, but no less clear. The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. She had rehearsed this moment a dozen times in the privacy of her mother's old cottage, whispering the refusal to the walls and the worn quilts, testing the shape of it on her tongue. But here, surrounded by the pack's finest and the weight of generations of tradition, the words felt heavier than she'd imagined. They felt like stone dropping into still water. King Matthias did not move. His hands rested on the arms of his chair, his shoulders broad and still beneath the dark fabric of his formal coat. His gaze held hers, and for a moment she thought she saw something flicker there. Surprise, perhaps? Or something quieter. Something that looked almost like pain. But he said nothing. The silence stretched. Someone shifted in the crowd behind her. A murmur began to rise, low and uneasy, the sound of shock rippling outward like a wave. The eldest among the council, a woman with silver hair braided tight against her scalp, leaned forward and opened her mouth to speak. Elara turned before the words could reach her. She walked down the center aisle with her chin lifted, her steps measured and sure. Her dress brushed against the polished stone floor, the hem whispering with each stride. She did not look back. She did not pause at the heavy wooden doors, or hesitate when the cold night air met her face. She simply left. The forest path that led to her cottage was dark and familiar. Moonlight filtered through the canopy above, painting the ground in silver and shadow. Elara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and let her feet carry her forward, one step after another, until the sounds of the hall faded completely behind her. Her heart was still beating too fast. She had expected anger. She had expected the king to stand, to command her back, to invoke the old laws that bound an alpha's claim to acceptance and duty. She had prepared herself for confrontation, for the cold weight of authority pressing down on her refusal. But there had been none of that, only silence, only his eyes, dark and searching, watching her as though he were trying to understand something he had not expected to find. Elara reached the cottage just as the moon cleared the treetops. The small stone structure sat nestled at the edge of the pack's territory, surrounded by wildflowers her mother had planted years ago. The windows were dark. The door creaked softly as she pushed it open and stepped inside. She lit a candle on the table and sank into the chair by the hearth, her hands trembling now that no one was there to see. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, soft and steady as it had been on the last night they'd sat together in this very room. Elara had been younger then, still hopeful that the world might bend toward kindness if she only waited long enough. "A bond is sacred," her mother had said, brushing a hand through Elara's hair with gentle fingers. "But it is not sacred if it is forced. Love, true love, must be chosen. It must be yours to give." Elara closed her eyes and let the memory settle over her like a blanket. Her mother had understood what it meant to lose herself in something she had not chosen. She had lived it. She had smiled through years of quiet sorrow, bound to a mate who had claimed her because tradition demanded it, not because his heart had led him there. And when he had died, her mother had grieved not for the man, but for the years she had spent trying to love someone who had never truly seen her. Elara would not walk that same path. The fire in the hearth had gone cold. She rose and knelt before it, stacking kindling with careful hands, striking flint until sparks caught and flame began to bloom. The warmth spread slowly, filling the small room with flickering light. She thought of the king's face again, the stillness in his posture, the way he had not raised his voice or reached for her, the way he had simply let her go. It unsettled her more than anger would have. She had expected a king. She had expected authority and command, the weight of power wielded without question. But in that moment, sitting silent on his throne, Matthias had looked less like a ruler and more like a man caught off guard by something he could not name. Elara drew her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, staring into the fire. She had done the right thing. She knew that. She had honored her own heart, her own voice, the lessons her mother had pressed into her hands, like seeds meant to grow in careful soil. She had claimed her right to choose, and no law or tradition could take that from her, but the silence still echoed in her chest. She wondered if he would come for her. If the council would send emissaries in the morning, armed with old texts and stern words, reminding her of duty and destiny and the bonds that were said to be written in the stars. She wondered if the pack would turn cold toward her, if they would see her refusal as rebellion rather than truth. She wondered if King Matthias would try to change her mind. The candle on the table flickered, casting long shadows against the walls. Elara rose and moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside to look out at the forest beyond. The trees stood tall and dark, their branches swaying gently in the night breeze. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, its voice low and mournful. She pressed her palm against the cool glass and let out a slow breath. "I will not be your bride," she whispered again, testing the words one more time in the safety of her solitude. They still felt true. They still felt like the only answer she could give. But beneath them, buried deep where she had not expected to find it, was something else. Something small and fragile and unexpected. Curiosity. She had seen the way Matthias looked at her, not with possession or entitlement, but with something quieter, something that had hesitated at the edges of his expression, uncertain and unguarded. And she wondered, just for a moment, what might have been written in that silence. Elara let the curtain fall and returned to the fire. She would not change her mind. She would not surrender her voice or her choice, simply because tradition expected it. But she would not close the door entirely either. If King Matthias wanted to speak to her, he would have to come as a man, not as a king. He would have to ask, not command. And perhaps, if he did, she would listen. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. The night settled around the cottage like a blanket, and Elara sat in the warmth and the quiet, holding her choice close to her heart. Morning came slowly through the small windows of the cottage, the light thin and pale, filtered through the mist that clung to the edges of the forest. Elara woke to the sound of birdsong and the faint rustle of wind through the eaves. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then memory returned, settling over her like a familiar cloak. She had refused the bond. She had walked away from the Alpha King. She sat up slowly, pushing the quilts aside, and looked around the room. Everything here carried the mark of her mother's hands. The wooden shelves lined with jars of dried herbs. The worn chair by the fireplace. The table where they had shared so many quiet meals together, speaking of small things and large ones. Laughter and grief woven into the same conversations. Her mother had lived here alone after her father died. She had chosen solitude over a second bond, even when the pack elders had pressed her to consider other matches. Elara had been young then, but she remembered the way her mother had stood firm, her voice calm and unwavering. A bond is sacred, her mother had told her once, hands busy kneading dough at this very table. But it is not sacred if it is not chosen. Love cannot be commanded, Elara. It must be given freely, or it is only duty dressed in pretty words. Elara rose and moved to the window, pulling it open to let the cool morning air wash over her face. The forest stretched out before her, green and endless, the trees standing like patient guardians. She had always felt safe here, even as a child. This place had been her refuge then, and it was her refuge now. She dressed slowly, pulling on simple clothes, a soft tunic and worn trousers, and tied her hair back with a ribbon her mother had woven years ago. There was work to be done. The cottage had stood empty for months since her mother's passing, and though Elara had visited often, she had not lived here. Not until now. She walked through the small rooms, taking inventory. The roof needed patching in one corner. The garden had grown wild, the herbs and flowers tangled together in a riot of green. The woodpile was low, and the shutters on the back window hung crooked on their hinges. It would take time to set things right. But time was something she had now, and she welcomed the work. It would keep her hands busy and her mind focused, grounded in something she could see and touch and mend. Elara stepped outside and stood in the garden, breathing in the scent of damp earth and growing things. She knelt and began to pull weeds, her fingers sinking into the soil, feeling the cool dampness against her palms. The rhythm of the work was soothing, familiar. Her mother had taught her to tend this garden, to speak softly to the plants, to listen to the land and let it guide her. As she worked, her thoughts drifted back to the gathering, to the moment she had spoken those words aloud, to the silence that had followed, thick and heavy, pressing against her from all sides. She remembered the faces of the council, the shock and disapproval etched into their expressions. She remembered the murmurs that had rippled through the crowd, voices rising in confusion and judgment. And she remembered Matthias. He had stood there, tall and still, his expression unreadable. He had not raged or demanded. He had not called her back or tried to force her hand. He had simply watched her leave, and in that silence, she had felt something she had not expected: respect. Or perhaps it had only been shock. She could not be certain. Elara pulled another handful of weeds and tossed them aside. It did not matter now. She had made her choice, and she would stand by it. Whatever came next, she would face it here, in this place that had always held her when the world felt too large. She worked through the morning, losing herself in the quiet labor. The sun climbed higher, warming the air, and the mist began to lift from the trees. By midday, she had cleared a good portion of the garden and stacked a pile of weeds near the edge of the clearing. Her hands were dirty, her back ached, but there was a satisfaction in it, a sense of purpose that felt solid and true. She went inside and washed her hands in the basin by the window, then made herself a simple meal. Bread and cheese, a handful of berries she had found growing near the garden's edge. She ate slowly, sitting at the table where her mother had sat so many times before. The cottage was quiet around her, peaceful, but beneath that peace, there was something else. A thread of uncertainty that she could not quite ignore. She wondered if the pack would leave her alone, if they would respect her choice, or if they would see it as a challenge that needed to be corrected. She wondered if Matthias would send someone to speak on his behalf, to try to persuade her with reasons and promises. She wondered if he would come himself. The thought made her chest tighten in a way she did not fully understand. She told herself it was only caution, only the natural wariness of someone who had defied tradition and did not yet know the consequences. But there was something else there too, something softer and harder to name. Curiosity. She had seen him only once before the gathering, at a distance, during a ceremony months ago. He had seemed distant then, untouchable, wrapped in the authority of his position. But last night, In that moment of silence after her refusal, she had glimpsed something different. A flicker of vulnerability, perhaps. A hesitation that spoke of something more than wounded pride. Elara pushed the thought aside and rose from the table. She could not afford to soften now. She had made her choice for a reason, and she would not let doubt undo it. She spent the afternoon patching the roof, balancing carefully on the old wooden ladder her mother had kept leaning against the side of the cottage. The work was slow and careful, each shingle placed with attention, each nail driven home with steady hands. The sun was warm on her back, and the breeze carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. By the time the light began to fade, she was tired in a way that felt good. Her muscles ached, her hands were sore, but she had accomplished something real. The roof was whole again. The garden was clearer. The cottage felt a little more like home. She made herself tea and sat by the fire as the evening settled in, the flames casting soft light across the room. She thought of her mother again, of all the evenings they had spent like this, talking quietly or simply sitting in comfortable silence. Her mother had warned her about bonds forged in duty rather than choice. She had told Elara to guard her heart, to never let tradition take from her what was hers alone to give. And Elara had listened. She had carried those lessons with her, even when the world outside this cottage had tried to tell her otherwise. But her mother had also told her something else, something Elara had not thought of until now. "Do not close yourself off entirely, my girl," her mother had said once, her voice soft and tired near the end. "Love can surprise you. It can arrive in ways you do not expect. Just make sure that when it does, it is yours to choose." Elara wrapped her hands around the warm cup and stared into the fire. She had chosen herself. She had claimed her voice and her right to decide her own path. But she had not closed the door. Not yet. The fire crackled softly. The night deepened around the cottage. And somewhere in the quiet, Elara wondered if she would hear footsteps on the path tomorrow. If Matthias would come, not as a king, but as a man who had been given her answer and still wished to speak. She did not know what she would say if he did, but she would listen. That much she could promise. Elara heard the footsteps just as the sun dipped below the tree line. She had been standing at the window, her hands stilled over the counter where she had been preparing a simple meal. The sound was deliberate, unhurried, the careful pace of someone who did not wish to startle or intrude. She knew who it was before she saw him. Her heart gave a small, uncertain leap. She set down the knife and wiped her hands on her apron, her breath coming a little quicker than she would have liked. She had told herself she would listen if he came. She had promised herself that much. But now that he was here, standing somewhere beyond her door, she felt the weight of that promise settle over her like a cloak she was not sure she wanted to wear. She moved to the door slowly, giving herself time to steady her breathing. When she opened it, Matthias stood at the edge of the small stone path, several paces back, his hands at his sides. He was not dressed as a king tonight. He wore a simple dark tunic and trousers, his sleeves rolled to his forearms, his hair falling loose around his face. The evening light touched his features gently, softening the strong lines of his jaw and brow. He did not step closer. He simply looked at her, his expression calm and open, without expectation. "Elara," he said quietly, "I came to ask if you would speak with me, not as your king, just as myself." She held the edge of the door, her fingers curling against the wood. She had expected commands. She had expected authority wrapped in polite words, the kind of courtesy that was really just control wearing a softer mask. But there was none of that in his voice. There was only a question, plainly offered. with no weight behind it except what she chose to give. "You didn't have to come alone," she said finally. "I know," Matthias replied, "but I wanted to." She watched him for a long moment, searching his face for something she could name. Pride, perhaps? Wounded dignity? The kind of anger that men tried to bury when they had been refused in front of others. But she found none of it. He stood there in the fading light, patient and still, and waited for her answer. Elara let out a slow breath. She stepped back and opened the door a little wider. "Come in," she said softly. Matthias inclined his head and walked forward, his steps careful and measured. He paused at the threshold, his gaze lifting to meet hers, asking silent permission one more time. She nodded, and he stepped inside. The cottage felt smaller with him in it, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that made the space seem suddenly warmer, more present. He looked around slowly, taking in the simple furnishings. The firelight dancing on the old stone hearth, the worn table and chairs her mother had kept for so many years. "It's a kind place," he said quietly. "I can see why you chose to come here." Elara moved past him and set the kettle over the fire. She did not look at him as she spoke. "It was my mother's," she said. "She lived here after my father died. She liked the quiet." "And you?" Matthias asked, gently. "Do you like the quiet too?" She paused, her hands hovering over the tea leaves. "Yes, I do." He did not press. He simply stood near the hearth, his hands folded loosely in front of him, and waited while she prepared the tea. When it was ready, she poured 2 cups and brought them to the table. She gestured to the chair across from her, and he sat down without hesitation, his movements easy and unassuming. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly. The scent of chamomile and honey filled the air. Elara wrapped her hands around her cup and looked down into the pale liquid, her thoughts tangled and uncertain. "I didn't come to argue with you," Matthias said at last, his voice low and steady. "I didn't come to change your mind or make claims I have no right to make." She lifted her gaze to his. "Then why did you come?" He met her eyes, and she saw something there she had not expected. Grief. Old and deep, carried quietly for a long time. "Because I wanted you to know that I heard you," he said. "And I wanted to tell you something I should have said, before the ceremony, before any of this began." Elara set her cup down slowly. "What is that?" He looked down at his hands for a moment, as though gathering the words carefully. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, gentler than she had ever heard it. "I lost someone once," he said. "A long time ago. Her name was Saren. She was everything. We were bonded, not by ceremony, but by choice. I loved her the way I thought I would only ever love once in this life." Elara's breath caught. She had heard whispers of the king's past, stories half told and never confirmed, but she had never known the truth of it. She waited, silent, and let him speak. "She died," Matthias continued, his voice steady but pained. "It was sudden, an illness that took her before I could understand what was happening. I was younger then, newer to the crown. And I thought I would never feel anything like that again." He lifted his eyes to hers, and Elara saw the honesty in them, unguarded and clear. "When the elders told me about you," he said, "they spoke of tradition, of duty, of the bond that could strengthen the pack. And I agreed to it because I thought, perhaps it was time. Perhaps I could honor what I had lost by moving forward, by choosing something that would serve others." Elara's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, but the words would not come. "But I never wanted to force you," Matthias said quietly. I never wanted you to stand beside me because tradition demanded it. I hoped you might choose me, not because you had to, but because you wanted to. The silence that followed was soft and full. Elara looked at him across the small table, this man who had come to her door without guards or ceremony, who had spoken of loss and hope with a voice that carried no command, only truth. You could have told me that before, she said softly. I know, Matthias replied. I should have. I was afraid, I think. Afraid that if I spoke of it, you would see only the weight of what I had lost, and not the man I am trying to be now. Elara's chest ached with something she could not name. She reached for her tea again, her hands trembling just slightly, and took a slow sip. The warmth spread through her, steadying her breath. I don't know what to say, she admitted. You don't have to say anything, Matthias said gently. I only wanted you to know. That's all. She nodded slowly, her thoughts turning over his words, his grief, his quiet hope. She had expected anger or pride. She had expected him to arrive as a king, but he had come as a man who had loved and lost, who had carried that loss with him and still found the courage to hope again. It changed something in her. Not everything, not yet, but something. Thank you, she said quietly, for telling me. Matthias inclined his head. Thank you for listening. They sat together in the firelight, the tea warm between them, and the night settled gently around the cottage. The fire had burned low, casting softer shadows across the small room. Elara watched the embers shift and settle, her tea grown cool in her hands. She had not realized how much time had passed since Matthias had spoken, since his words had filled the quiet space between them with something she had not expected to find. She glanced at him across the table. He sat with his cup cradled gently, his gaze distant but not cold. There was a stillness to him now, a peace that had not been there when he first arrived. She wondered if sharing his grief had lightened it, even just a little. Can I ask you something? She said softly. Matthias looked up, his expression open. Of course. Elara hesitated, searching for the right words. When you lost her, did you ever think about refusing the bond? About walking away before it was too late? He considered her question carefully, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup. No, he said after a moment. I didn't. Not because I was certain it was right, but because I wanted to choose her. I wanted to see where that choice would lead, even knowing it could end in loss. Elara's throat tightened. And you don't regret it? I regret that she's gone, Matthias said quietly. I regret every moment I don't have with her. But I don't regret loving her. I don't regret choosing her, even though it hurt when I lost her. He paused, his gaze holding hers. Love always carries that risk, Elara. Whether it's a bond or something you build on your own. The risk is always there. She looked down at her hands, her chest aching with the weight of his words. She had spent so long afraid of losing herself, afraid of being bound to something she had no say in, that she had not considered the other side of that fear. The possibility that choosing someone, truly choosing them, might be worth the risk. I don't know if I'm ready for that, she admitted. I'm not asking you to be, Matthias said gently. I'm only asking you to believe that I won't force you into something you don't want. That's all. Elara met his eyes again, and she saw the truth there, steady and unshaken. He meant what he said. He had come here not to claim her, not to demand her obedience, but to offer her something she had not expected. A choice. A real one. She took a slow breath, letting the warmth of the fire settle into her bones. My mother used to tell me stories, she said quietly, about wolves who were bound by tradition, by duty, and how some of them lost themselves in it. She told me to be careful. to make sure that if I ever accepted a bond, it was mine to choose. Matthias nodded slowly. She sounds like a wise woman. She was, Elara said, her voice softening with memory. She died before I was old enough to really understand what she meant. But I think I've been holding on to her warning so tightly that I forgot she also told me something else. What was that? Matthias asked. Elara's lips curved into a faint, sad smile. She told me that love, real love, isn't something that takes from you. It's something that grows with you, that you build together. She paused, her gaze dropping to the table. I think I've been so afraid of losing myself that I forgot to look for that. For something I could build. Matthias was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was soft and full of understanding. Then take your time, he said. There's no rush, no deadline. If you need space, I'll give it to you. If you need time to think, I'll wait. Elara looked up at him, her chest tight with something she could not quite name. Gratitude, maybe. Or relief. Or something deeper, something she was not ready to admit yet. Why are you being so kind to me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Matthias's expression softened, and he set his cup down gently on the table. Because you deserve kindness, he said simply. Because you stood in front of the entire pack and said no. And that took more courage than most people will ever have. And because... He hesitated, his gaze searching hers. Because I want you to see me as I am, not as the king, not as the bond the elders chose. Just me. Elara's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to look away, to protect herself from the vulnerability in his eyes, but she found she could not. There was something raw and honest in his words, something that made her heart ache in a way she had not felt before. I don't know if I can do that, she said softly. I don't know if I can see past everything else yet. Then let me help you, Matthias said. Let me show you who I am, not through words, but through time. Through being here, if you'll let me. Elara's hands trembled slightly as she set her cup down. She had expected so many things when he arrived. Anger, pride, demands. But he had given her none of that. He had given her only honesty and patience and a quiet respect that she had not known she needed. I don't know what this will look like, she said carefully. I don't know if I'll ever be ready to accept the bond, but I'm willing to try, to see who you are, if you mean what you say. Matthias's expression softened into something that looked like hope, fragile and careful. I do, he said. I promise you, I do. Elara nodded slowly, her heart beating a little faster in her chest. She did not know where this would lead. She did not know if she would ever be able to let go of her fear entirely. But for the first time since the ceremony, she felt something shift inside her. A small opening, a crack in the wall she had built so carefully around herself. Then, I suppose we'll see, she said quietly. Matthias smiled, a small, genuine curve of his lips that reached his eyes. We will, he said. They sat together as the fire dimmed further, the night deepening around them. The silence between them was no longer heavy with tension, but soft and full of something Elara could not yet name. She felt the weight of his presence, steady and calm, and for the first time, it did not feel like a threat. When Matthias finally rose to leave, he moved slowly, as though giving her time to speak if she needed to. But Elara said nothing, only watched as he walked to the door and paused with his hand on the latch. Thank you, he said quietly, glancing back at her, for letting me in. Thank you, Elara replied, her voice soft, for being honest. Matthias inclined his head, and then he stepped out into the night, the door closing gently behind him. Elara sat alone in the firelight, her thoughts turning over everything he had said, everything he had shared with her. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. She did not know if she could ever fully trust him, or if her heart would ever be ready to take that risk. But she knew one thing. He had not come as a king tonight. He had come as a man, and that was a beginning. The morning light came softly through the cottage windows, pale and gentle, touching the worn wooden table where Elara sat with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. She had not slept well. Her thoughts had circled endlessly through the night, replaying Matthias's words, the quiet grief in his eyes, the careful way he had spoken about loss and loneliness. She had expected so many things from him: arrogance, entitlement, the weight of a king's command pressing down on her until she had no choice but to bend. But he had given her none of that. He had given her honesty instead, and patience, and a willingness to sit in silence without demanding anything in return. It unsettled her, how much that mattered. Elara rose from the table and moved to the window, looking out at the forest that stretched beyond her small garden. The trees stood quiet and still, their branches swaying gently in the morning breeze. This place had been her refuge for so long, a sanctuary where she could be alone with her thoughts, away from the expectations of the pack, away from the weight of tradition that pressed down on her like stones. But now it felt different. Now there was a question lingering in the air, soft and insistent, that she could not ignore. What if he meant it? What if he truly was willing to give her the choice she had always wanted? She closed her eyes and pressed her forehead against the cool glass, her breath fogging the window. She had spent so long building walls around herself, so long protecting her heart from the very thing he was offering. And now that he had laid himself bare before her, now that he had shown her his own wounds and his own grief, she did not know what to do with the crack that had formed in those walls. She was afraid, not of him exactly, but of what it might mean to let him in, to risk herself, to open her heart to something she had never believed she could have. The sound of footsteps on the path outside pulled her from her thoughts. Elara turned, her pulse quickening, and moved to the door. She opened it slowly, cautiously, and found Matthias standing there in the morning light, his expression calm and careful. He did not smile, did not speak right away. He simply looked at her, his eyes searching hers as though waiting for permission. "I wasn't sure if you'd want me to come back," he said quietly. "But I wanted to, if you're willing." Elara hesitated, her hand still on the door. She could send him away. She could tell him she needed more time, more space, more proof that he would not become the thing she feared. But something in his steady gaze, something in the gentleness of his voice, made her step aside instead. "Come in," she said softly. Matthias inclined his head and stepped over the threshold, moving carefully, as though aware of how fragile this moment was. Elara closed the door behind him and gestured toward the fire, which she had rekindled that morning more out of habit than warmth. They sat together as they had the night before, the space between them still cautious, but no longer quite so tense. Elara folded her hands in her lap, searching for the words she needed, the questions that had kept her awake through the long hours of the night. "You said you lost someone," she began, her voice quiet. "Your mate." Matthias nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I did. And you still feel that loss," Elara continued, the words careful. "Even now." "Every day," he said simply. "It doesn't fade. It just changes. You learn to carry it." Elara swallowed, her chest tightening. She had seen the truth of that in his eyes the night before, the way grief had settled into him like a second skin, and it made her question everything she had believed about what it meant to be bound to someone. "I don't know if I can do that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to risk losing myself like that." Matthias turned to look at her then, his expression soft and full of understanding. "You're stronger than you think," he said gently, "but I'm not asking you to risk yourself. I'm asking you to let me walk beside you, not ahead of you, not over you, beside you." Elara met his gaze, her heart beating faster in her chest. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that it could be different, that she could have a bond that did not erase her, that did not take away her voice or her choices. But the fear was still there, deep and stubborn, wrapping itself around her ribs like iron bands. "What if I can't?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if I try, and I still can't let you in?" Matthias was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was steady and sure. "Then I'll still be here," he said. "I won't force you. I won't demand what you can't give. But I won't stop hoping either, not for you." Elara felt something crack inside her then. Something deep and protected that she had kept locked away for so long. She had expected him to argue, to push, to tell her she was wrong or foolish or afraid for no reason. But he had done none of that. He had simply listened. He had simply stayed. "I'm afraid," she admitted, the words raw and unsteady. "I'm afraid of losing who I am. I'm afraid of becoming someone's shadow. My mother, she warned me about bonds like that. She told me to choose for myself, to never let anyone take that choice away." "She was right," Matthias said quietly, "and I'm not here to take that choice from you. I'm here to offer you one. A real one. Not because tradition says so, not because the bond demands it, but because I want you to have the freedom to say yes or no on your own terms." Elara blinked, her vision blurring with tears she had not expected. She had spent so long believing that a bond meant surrender, that it meant giving up the parts of herself that mattered most. But Matthias was offering her something different. He was offering her a bond built on choice, on respect, on the understanding that she was whole and complete on her own. "I don't know if I'm ready," she said, her voice breaking, "but I don't want to push you away either." Matthias reached out slowly, his hand hovering near hers, waiting. Elara looked down at it, at the quiet offering he was making, and after a moment she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady, and she felt the tension in her chest ease just a little. "Then we take it slowly," he said. "One day at a time. No expectations. No pressure. Just us." Elara nodded, her throat tight. She did not know where this would lead. She did not know if her heart would ever be ready to take the full leap, to accept the bond without fear or hesitation. But she knew one thing. Matthias had listened to her. He had heard her fears and had not dismissed them. He had seen her as she was, and he had stayed. And that was enough to begin. They sat together in the quiet morning light, their hands joined, the fire crackling softly beside them. Elara felt the weight of her fear still pressing against her ribs, but it was no longer suffocating. It was simply there, a part of her that she would carry forward, one careful step at a time. And for the first time in a long time, she did not feel alone. The morning after their conversation by the fire, Elara woke to the sound of footsteps on the path outside her cottage. She rose slowly, wrapping her mother's shawl around her shoulders, and peered through the window. Matthias stood at the edge of her garden, a leather satchel slung over one shoulder and his sleeves rolled to his elbows. He was not dressed in the formal attire of a king. He looked like a man ready to work. She opened the door before he could knock. He turned at the sound, and his expression softened when he saw her. "I hope I'm not too early," he said. Elara shook her head, still half caught in sleep and surprise. "What are you doing here?" Matthias gestured toward the cottage roof, where a section of shingles had been damaged by the last storm. "You mentioned yesterday that the roof was leaking. I thought I could help fix it. If you'd like." She stared at him, uncertain how to respond. It had been so long since anyone had simply shown up to help, without expectation or demand. Her mother had taught her to rely on herself, to be strong enough to stand alone. But Matthias was not asking her to be weak. He was offering his hands, not his authority. She began, then stopped. She wanted to say no, to protect the walls she had built so carefully. But she also wanted to let him in. Just a little more. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you." Matthias smiled, and it was the kind of smile that reached his eyes, warm and unburdened. He set down his satchel and pulled out a bundle of shingles and a small hammer. Elara watched as he set up a ladder against the side of the cottage, moving with the ease of someone who had done this kind of work before. "You know how to repair roofs?" she asked, stepping into the garden. "I didn't grow up a king," Matthias said, climbing the first few rungs. "I learned to work with my hands long before I learned to rule. My father made sure of that." Elara felt a flicker of curiosity. She had only ever known him as the Alpha King, distant and untouchable. But here, in the soft morning light, he was simply a man who knew how to fix what was broken. She moved to hold the base of the ladder steady, and Matthias glanced down at her. "You don't have to do that," he said gently. "I've got it." "I know," Elara replied. "But I want to help." He nodded, and there was something in his gaze that made her chest tighten. Not fear this time. Something softer. They worked in quiet companionship, the only sounds the tap of the hammer and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Elara watched as Matthias carefully replaced each damaged shingle, his movements deliberate and patient. He did not rush. He did not demand her attention or ask for praise. He simply worked, and the quiet steadiness of it settled something restless inside her. When the roof was finished, Matthias climbed down and wiped his brow with the back of his hand. Elara stepped back, tilting her head to look at the fresh repair. It was solid, secure, the kind of work that would last. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was softer than she intended. Matthias turned to her, his expression open. "You don't have to thank me." "I do," Elara said. "Because you didn't have to come here. You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to," Matthias replied. "Not because I think it will change your mind, but because I care, and I wanted you to know that." Elara looked away, her throat tight. She had spent so long believing that care came with conditions, that affection was a bargaining chip used to take more than it gave. But Matthias had shown her something different. He had given without asking for return, and that small act meant more than she knew how to say. The following days unfolded in the same gentle rhythm. Matthias came each morning, sometimes with tools, sometimes with nothing more than his presence. He helped her clear the overgrown weeds from her mother's garden, replant the flower beds that had been neglected for too long. He did not speak unless she wanted to speak. He did not press her for answers or decisions. He simply stayed. And Elara found herself looking forward to his arrival each day, the quiet comfort of knowing he would be there, steady and unhurried. One afternoon, as they knelt side by side in the garden, Elara glanced at him, His hands were dusted with soil, his sleeves rolled high, and there was a contentment in his expression that she had not seen before. "Why do you keep coming back?" she asked quietly. Matthias paused, his fingers stilling in the earth. He looked at her, and his eyes held a warmth that made her breath catch. "Because I want to know you," he said simply, "not as a bond, not as tradition, just you." Elara's heart stumbled over itself. She had expected many things from him. Persuasion, persistence, even frustration, but not this quiet, unwavering patience. "I'm not easy to know," she said, her voice unsteady. "I know," Matthias replied, "and I don't mind." They worked until the sun began to dip low, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. When Matthias finally stood to leave, Elara walked with him to the edge of her garden. He turned to her, and there was a question in his eyes, one he did not speak aloud. "Will you come back tomorrow?" Elara asked before she could stop herself. Matthias smiled, soft and sure. "If you want me to." "I do," she said, and the words felt like a small surrender, the kind that did not hurt. "Then I will," Matthias said. He left as the first stars appeared, and Elara stood in the fading light, her heart no longer armored, but tentatively open. She did not know where this path would lead. She did not know if her walls would ever come down, completely. But for the first time, she was willing to find out. That night, as she sat by the fire with a cup of tea in her hands, Elara realized something that both frightened and comforted her. She was no longer merely tolerating Matthias's presence. She was beginning to need it, not in a way that diminished her strength, but in a way that reminded her she did not have to carry everything alone. And that small, quiet shift felt like the beginning of something she had never believed possible. A bond built not on destiny or duty, but on the fragile, tender choice to let someone in. The days that followed carried a rhythm that felt both new and strangely familiar. Matthias continued to arrive each morning, his presence as steady as sunrise, and Elara found herself waiting for him without quite realizing when the waiting had begun. They worked together in comfortable quiet, spoke when words mattered, and sat in silence when they did not. It was a kind of intimacy she had never known, one that asked nothing of her but her presence. One evening, as the light began to soften and the air grew cool, Matthias suggested they walk, not back toward the pack center, but deeper into the forest that bordered her cottage, where the trees grew thick and the world felt held in a gentle hush. Elara agreed without hesitation. They walked side by side along a narrow path, worn smooth by years of footsteps. The forest around them was alive with the quiet sounds of evening, birds settling into their nests, the rustle of leaves stirred by a passing breeze, the distant call of an owl greeting the dusk. Neither spoke for a long while, and the silence felt easy, unburdened. Eventually, the path opened into a small clearing, where wildflowers grew in scattered clusters, their pale petals catching the last light of the day. Matthias slowed, then stopped, turning his gaze toward the horizon where the sun hung low and golden. Elara stopped beside him, her eyes following his. "I used to come here," Matthias said quietly, "when I needed to think." Elara glanced at him. His profile was calm, but there was something unguarded in his expression, a softness she had not seen before. "What did you think about?" she asked. Matthias smiled faintly, though it did not quite reach his eyes. "Everything. Nothing. The weight of decisions I could not take back." He paused, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "And whether I would ever feel whole again." Elara's chest tightened. She understood that feeling more than she could say. "And now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Matthias turned to her then, and the look in his eyes was so open, so quietly honest, that it stole the breath from her lungs. "Now I think about you," he said. The world seemed to still around them. Elara felt the weight of his words settle over her, not heavy but warm, like sunlight after a long winter. "Matthias," she began, but her voice faltered. He shook his head gently, a small, self-conscious smile touching his lips. "I didn't plan to say it tonight, or maybe ever," he exhaled slowly, as though gathering his courage. "But I don't want to pretend anymore, Elara. Not with you." She swallowed hard, her heart beating fast and unsteady. "I didn't come to your door that first night because of tradition," Matthias continued, his voice steady but soft. "I came because I wanted to know you, to understand the woman who was brave enough to say no to everything the pack expected. And the more time I spent with you, the more I realized—" He paused, searching for the right words. "I wasn't falling for a bond. I was falling for you." Elara's throat felt tight, her eyes burning with unshed tears. She wanted to speak, but the words tangled in her chest, caught between fear and something far more fragile. "I know you didn't ask for this," Matthias said quietly. "And I'm not asking you to feel the same. I needed you to know. Not as your king. Not as someone bound to you by fate. Just as a man who has come to care for you more than he ever expected." Elara closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the rawness of his honesty, by the way he had laid his heart before her without demand or expectation. When she opened them again, she found him watching her with a patience that made her want to weep. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "I know," Matthias said gently. "I spent so long protecting myself," she continued, her voice trembling. "Building walls so high I thought nothing could reach me. And then you." She trailed off, shaking her head. "You didn't try to tear them down. You just waited. And somehow that scared me more than anything." Matthias's expression softened. "I never wanted to take your choice from you, Elara. Not then. Not now." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the truth written plainly in his eyes. He was not asking her to surrender. He was offering her the freedom to choose, even if that choice was not him. And in that moment, she realized something that both terrified and freed her. Her walls had not been torn down. They had simply stopped mattering. "I didn't think I could feel this way again," Elara said quietly. "I didn't think I wanted to." "And now?" Matthias asked, echoing her earlier question, his voice barely audible. Elara stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she could feel the warmth of him, steady and real. She reached for his hand, her fingers trembling as they found his. "Now I think I've been falling too," she said softly, "and I didn't even realize it until you said the words I was too afraid to speak." Matthias's breath caught, and his hand closed gently around hers, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture so tender it made her chest ache. "I don't need a bond to tell me what my heart already knows," Elara continued, her voice stronger now. "I don't need fate or tradition to make this real. I just need you, the way you are, the way you've been with me." Matthias lifted his free hand, hesitating for just a heartbeat before brushing a strand of hair from her face. His touch was feather-light, reverent, and Elara felt the last of her fear begin to dissolve. "You don't know how long I've hoped to hear you say that," he murmured. Elara smiled, and it felt like the first true smile she had offered in years. "I didn't know I could." They stood together in the clearing as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. The world around them felt vast and quiet, as though it had been waiting for this moment just as they had. Matthias's gaze dropped to her lips, and Elara's heart raced, but not with fear. with anticipation, with trust. "May I?" he asked, his voice a low whisper. Elara nodded, her breath shallow and unsteady. "Yes." Matthias leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, but she did not. His lips brushed hers, soft and unhurried, a kiss that tasted of patience and quiet devotion. It was not a claiming, it was a promise. Elara's eyes closed, and she leaned into him, her hand tightening in his as the kiss deepened just enough to speak everything words could not. When they finally pulled apart, Matthias rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her skin. "I choose you," Elara whispered, "not because I have to, because I want to." Matthias smiled, and it was a smile full of relief and wonder. "Then I'm the luckiest man alive." They stood together as the stars began to appear, hand in hand, hearts open, and for the first time and longer than she could remember, Elara felt the weight she had carried for so long begin to lift. She had chosen this. She had chosen him, and that choice, made freely and without regret, felt like the most powerful thing she had ever done. Elara woke the next morning with sunlight streaming through the cottage window and a quiet certainty settling in her chest. She lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of the forest beyond her walls, and realized something had shifted. The fear that had lived beneath her ribs for so long had softened into something gentler, something that felt almost like peace. She rose and dressed slowly, her thoughts turning over the events of the previous evening. Matthias's kiss, his whispered words, the way he had held her as though she were something precious and rare. She had chosen him. She had said the words aloud, and they had not felt like surrender. They had felt like freedom. By the time she finished braiding her hair and stepped outside, the morning air was crisp and cool against her skin. She found Matthias already at work in the garden, his sleeves rolled up, his hands dark with soil. He looked up when he heard her approach, and the smile that crossed his face was so warm it made her chest tighten. "You're up early," she said, stopping at the edge of the garden bed. "I didn't want to wake you," Matthias replied, brushing his hands off on his trousers. "But I thought I'd finish what we started yesterday." Elara glanced at the neat rows of herbs and vegetables he had been tending, and something tender stirred in her. He had been here, working quietly, without expectation or fanfare, simply caring for the space she called home. "You didn't have to," she said softly. Matthias straightened, his gaze steady and kind. "I wanted to." They stood together in the morning light, and Elara felt the truth of what she had admitted the night before settle even deeper. She had fallen for this man, not because fate had demanded it, not because tradition had bound them, but because he had shown her, day after quiet day, what it meant to be chosen without being claimed. "Matthias," she said, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "I've been thinking." He took a step closer, his expression open and attentive. "Tell me." Elara met his gaze, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. "I don't want to hide here anymore. I don't want to pretend that what's between us is separate from the rest of my life. I want..." She paused, searching for the right words. "I want to stop running." Matthias's breath caught, and she saw the emotion flicker across his face. Hope. Relief. Something deeper still. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. Elara nodded, her throat tight. "I'm sure. I don't want to accept the bond because I'm afraid of what people will think if I don't. I want to accept it because my heart has already chosen. Because I trust you. Because I want a future with you. On my terms." Matthias closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his hands coming up to cup her face with a tenderness that made her eyes sting. "You have no idea how much that means to me," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "I never wanted you to feel trapped. I only ever wanted you to feel free." Elara leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. "You gave me that," she whispered. "You gave me the space to choose." And I did. Matthias kissed her forehead, then her temple, and finally her lips, a soft press of warmth and devotion that left her breathless. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright. "Then let's go home," he said. "Together." Elara smiled, and it felt like the easiest thing in the world. Together. They returned to the pack territory that afternoon, walking side by side through the forest paths Elara had known all her life. The trees were familiar, the birdsong unchanged, but everything felt different now. She was not the same woman who had fled this place a week ago. She was not the same woman who had stood before the Alpha King and refused him. She was someone who had learned to trust herself, someone who had chosen love not because it was easy, but because it was real. When they reached the edge of the village, a few pack members glanced their way, their expressions shifting from surprise to curiosity. Elara lifted her chin, her hand still clasped in Matthias's, and kept walking. She felt his thumb brush reassuringly across her knuckles, a silent promise that he was with her. The elders were gathered in the great hall when they arrived, the heavy wooden doors standing open in the afternoon light. Elara's heart beat faster as they stepped inside, but she did not falter. Matthias stayed close, his presence steady and grounding, and when the eldest of the council rose to greet them, his expression was one of cautious respect. "Elara," he said, his voice formal but not unkind, "you have returned." "I have," Elara replied, her voice clear, "and I have something to say." The room fell silent, and she felt the weight of every gaze upon her, but she did not shrink from it. She stood tall, her hand still in Matthias's, and spoke with the same honesty that had carried her through the past week. "I refused the bond before because I was afraid," she said. "Afraid of losing myself, afraid of being bound by something I didn't choose. But I'm not afraid anymore." She glanced at Matthias, and his eyes were full of quiet encouragement. She turned back to the elders, her voice unwavering. "I'm here to accept the bond, not because tradition demands it, not because I have no other choice, but because my heart has chosen freely, because I trust this man, and I trust myself, and because I want a future built on choice, not duty." The eldest elder studied her for a long moment, and then, slowly, he nodded. "Then the bond is yours to claim, Elara, as it always should have been." Elara felt the tension drain from her shoulders, and Matthias's hand tightened around hers. She turned to him, and the look on his face was one of pure, unguarded joy. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. Elara nodded, her smile trembling at the edges. "I am." Matthias lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. And then he spoke the words of the bond, his voice low and reverent. Elara repeated them, her own voice steady and sure, and as the final words fell between them, she felt something shift deep in her chest. Not a claiming, not a loss, but a joining, a connection forged not by fate, but by choice. When it was done, Matthias pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her in an embrace that felt like coming home. Elara rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and felt the last of her walls crumble away. "I love you," Matthias whispered into her hair. "Not because the bond tells me to, but because I do." Elara closed her eyes, her arms tightening around him. "I love you too." The hall around them erupted in quiet applause, but Elara barely heard it. All she could feel was the warmth of Matthias's embrace, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and the profound certainty that she had made the right choice. She had chosen him. She had chosen love, and she had done it on her own terms. When they finally pulled apart, Matthias leaned down and kissed her, soft and lingering, and Elara kissed him back with all the trust and hope she had fought so hard to find. They walked out of the hall together, hand in hand, and into the golden light of the late afternoon. The future stretched before them, uncertain and full of promise, and Elara knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, not because they had to, but because they chose to. The cottage came into view as they walked the familiar path through the forest, its stone walls softened by the amber glow of evening. Elara paused at the edge of the clearing, her hand still wrapped in Matthias's, and looked at the place that had sheltered her through doubt and discovery. "I thought I'd stay here forever," she said quietly. "Safe, alone, protected from anything that might hurt me." Matthias stood beside her, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. "And now?" Elara turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "Now I know that safety without connection isn't really living. It's just waiting." He reached up, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch as careful as it had been that first night at her door. "You don't have to leave this place behind. It's part of you, part of your story." "I know," Elara said, and she felt the truth of it settle in her chest. "But I don't need to hide here anymore. I'm ready to go forward. With you." Matthias smiled, and the warmth in his eyes made her breath catch. "Then let's go home." They walked together through the twilight, the trees parting to reveal the main village ahead. Lights flickered in windows, and the sound of evening laughter drifted on the breeze. Elara felt the weight of eyes turning toward them as they entered the square, but this time she didn't shrink from the attention. She walked beside Matthias, her head high, her hand steady in his. An elder woman stepped forward, her weathered face soft with approval. "You've made your choice, child." "I have," Elara said simply. The woman nodded, her smile gentle. "Then may it bring you both peace." Others followed, offering quiet words of blessing and respect. No one questioned her. No one demanded explanation. They saw what she and Matthias had become, and they honored it. When they reached the Alpha's hall, Matthias paused at the door. "This is your home now, too, if you want it to be." Elara looked up at the carved wood, the stone threshold worn smooth by generations. She thought of her mother's cottage, of the years she'd spent building walls. And then she thought of the week just past, of laughter over tea and shared work under the sun, of the quiet evenings when words weren't needed because presence was enough. "I want it," she said, "not because it's yours, because it's ours." Matthias opened the door, and they stepped inside together. The hall was warm and softly lit, a fire already burning low in the hearth. Elara moved toward it, drawn by the gentle heat, and Matthias followed. He didn't crowd her. He simply stood close, his presence a comfort rather than a claim. "I never imagined this," Elara admitted, staring into the flames. "I thought love was something that happened to you, something you couldn't control." "And now?" Matthias asked, his voice low. Elara turned to him, her heart full and steady. "Now I know it's something you choose. Every day, in 100 small ways." Matthias reached for her hand, lifting it gently and pressing his lips to her palm. The gesture was tender, reverent, and Elara felt warmth bloom through her chest. "I will choose you," he said softly, "every day, in every way that matters." Elara stepped closer, closing the distance between them, and rested her forehead against his. "And I will choose you." They stood like that for a long moment, breathing together, the bond between them no longer a weight but a bridge. When Matthias finally kissed her, It was slow and unhurried, a promise sealed with warmth and trust. Elara leaned into him, her arms wrapping around his shoulders, and felt the last shadow of fear dissolve. This was not surrender. This was not loss. This was freedom, chosen and shared. When they pulled apart, Matthias brushed his thumb along her cheek, his smile soft. "Stay with me tonight. Not because you have to, because you want to." Elara nodded, her voice sure. "I want to." They moved to the sitting room, where cushions were piled near the fire, and the air smelled faintly of cedar. Matthias poured 2 cups of tea, handing one to Elara before settling beside her. She tucked her legs beneath her, leaning into his side, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. They didn't speak for a while. They didn't need to. The silence was full and comfortable, the kind that came from knowing you were exactly where you belonged. Eventually, Elara set her cup aside and turned to Matthias, her hand resting over his heart. "I was so afraid of this, of losing myself in someone else. And now?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Now I know I won't," she said, "because you see me, all of me. And you don't ask me to be anything else." Matthias covered her hand with his own, his gaze steady. "You made me see what it means to truly honor someone, to wait, to listen, to let love be a choice, not a command." Elara smiled, her eyes soft. "We taught each other." "We did," Matthias agreed, "and we'll keep learning. Together." The fire crackled softly, and outside, the night settled over the village. Elara felt the pull of sleep beginning to tug at her, but she didn't want to move. Not yet. Here, wrapped in Matthias's warmth, she felt safe in a way she'd never known before. "Will you tell me about her?" Elara asked quietly. "Your first mate." Matthias went still for a moment, and then he exhaled slowly. "Her name was Lydia. She was kind, strong. She loved the forest more than the hall." Elara listened, her hand steady over his heart. "I thought I'd never feel whole again after she was gone," Matthias continued, his voice soft with old grief. "But then you walked away from me that night, and something in me woke up. You reminded me that love isn't about filling a space someone left behind. It's about finding someone new. Someone who makes you want to choose again." Elara blinked against the sting in her eyes. "She would have liked that you didn't stop living." "I think she would have liked you," Matthias said, his lips brushing the top of her head. "You're brave in ways I never was." Elara shook her head. "I was scared." "Bravery isn't the absence of fear," Matthias said gently. "It's choosing anyway." Elara closed her eyes, letting his words settle over her like a blanket. "Then we're both brave." "We are," Matthias agreed. They stayed by the fire until the flames burned low and the night grew deep. When Elara finally stood, Matthias rose with her, his hand never leaving hers. He led her to a quiet room at the back of the hall, where a wide bed was piled with soft blankets and the window looked out over the forest. "This is yours," he said, "for as long as you want it." Elara turned to him, her heart full. "Will you stay?" Matthias nodded, his expression tender. "If you want me to." "I do," Elara said. They lay down together, fully clothed, wrapped in each other's arms. Matthias held her close, his chin resting on the top of her head, and Elara listened to the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Thank you," she whispered into the quiet. "For what?" Matthias asked. "For waiting," Elara said. "For letting me choose." Matthias pressed a kiss to her hair. "Thank you for choosing me." Elara closed her eyes, her body relaxing into his warmth, and felt peace settle over her like the night itself. Tomorrow would come, with all its uncertainties and promises. But tonight she was exactly where she wanted to be, in the arms of the man she loved. The man she had chosen, the man who had chosen her in return. And that, Elara knew, was more than enough.